What's up, everyone? This week on the pod, we are doing another roundtable discussion, talking hardcore. So stay tuned for that. Please support the podcast by subscribing to it wherever you listen to it. Also, please take the time to like it, rate it, and review it, and share it with your friends. If you want to go the extra mile, you can go to patreon.com/185 miles south and become a monthly Patreon. There are bonus podcasts for every interview podcast. So check that out. The Patreons are my personal heroes, and they keep this podcast alive. Also, there is a playlist for every podcast. So you can go to 185milessouth.com, click that playlist link, and check out the songs behind the pod. And also, I think this is the last week I'm going to have the store up. So if you want to grab a 185 Mile South beanie, go ahead and handle business. Click that merch link on the website and get it before I close that stuff, because mail order is sorry. And let's get on with the pod.
"185 Miles South", a hardcore punk rock podcast.
What's up, everyone? This week on the pod, we're doing another roundtable discussion. We are talking punk and hardcore. And yeah, that's what's up. Help me out. You know him, you love him. He's episode 1. He's the legend, Joe Rivas. What's up, Joe?
Hey, everybody. How are things?
Hopefully good, huh? Also helping out, the best dressed man on the pod. It is episode 6, Daniel Sant. What's up, Daniel?
Hello.
No delay here. Also helping out, the smartest guy on the pod, and a future guest. Episode 180.
I dispute that.
Episode sometime in the future. It is Ben Edge, a.k.a. Ben Merlis, a.k.a. Bedge. What's up, Ben?
What's going on?
That's what's up. Appreciate that. All right. We got a bunch of topics this time around. And just for everyone out there, if you want to send us topics, you want to send questions, go ahead and do that. It is 185milessouth@gmail.com. That's the best way to do it. You can hit us up on social media too, but send it to the email is the easiest way for it to get saved. And Ben, you had the first topic, and maybe you want to lay it out there and explain it.
Ignorant riffs. What is the origin story of this, and how can music be ignorant?
Okay. Do you want to elaborate any more or no?
Oh, I was just wondering, like, I started hearing this, people refer to not the lyrics, or they're referring to the music itself as ignorant. Sometime around, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. And it just made me think, like, so, well, how can music be ignorant? Like if you play an A chord followed by a G chord followed by a C chord, like, that's ignorant. Like, how is that even possible? Like, ignorant is thinking and saying stupid shit. That's what I always thought ignorant meant. So I'm just wondering, how did it start? Who were the first bands it was applied to? And how would you define it? Like an ignorant riff or an ignorant part of a song?
Well, when this topic came across, Joe had a question that I thought was absolutely perfect for this. Joe, do you want to repeat that, or
I don't remember exactly what I said, but
you're just like, what the fuck is an ignorant riff?
Yeah, what the fuck is an ignorant riff? Yeah, that's pretty much what I said. Yeah.
So it's like the same question. Anyway, I just think it's hilarious that, Ben, you wrote a book on hip hop, and you're basically just like questioning an adjective. It's just slang, right? Like, it's like, oh, that person's cool. How can you say he's cool? Like, he's not cold. It's just an adjective, right? Like, someone just decided to use this word as, like, interchangeable of brutal, right?
Well, when you say it to someone who's very much in the know in hardcore, like, you've been around a long time, you've seen things. When someone says something, oh fuck, that's ignorant, it means that feet will be smashing faces and hands will be flailing back to that kind of riff, because it's like this is gonna create some really hard moshing.
Right. So then in that isn't it just interchangeable then with like brutal?
Right, brutal, or that's hard, or
it's hard.
Well, if we're going to really get into like the colloquial terms that are used within our little world, brutal like represents even more of a metallic edge, I would think, whereas ignorant represents more of a kind of bouncy, like, I don't know. It's all what it means to you, isn't it? Really,
I think that's fair. Like brutal, you just assume that it's maybe drop tuned and a lot of distortion.
Yeah.
Joe, is this making any more sense?
Yeah. So it's just a new clever term. So it's like yeah.
That's what I think.
Who is the most ignorant band of all time? Who is actually not an ignorant band?
I don't know. That's the interesting question.
Retaliate. Isn't retaliate the answer?
I don't think we're the top of any list. Have you seen all these 2020 lists?
Retaliate's always the answer.
Yeah. Thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. Daniel, what do you think? What's the most ignorant band ever? I mean, like if using it in this aspect, it would be like Hatebreed, right? Like they're the band that brought the mosh in every song and like really changed the game.
I would say bands that are way more even like a Bulldoze or something like that. That is just like, if you are anywhere on the dance floor where there's room to move, you are being smashed because those riffs and topics, perhaps, where it's all about smashing people and whatnot, can even add on to the ignorant riff with the ignorant vocal, with the ignorant lyrics, perhaps.
I mean, I guess that's fair. You're tracing the term back to like basically the origin of beatdown, which like Bulldoze would be considered. So, I mean, that might make sense.
Yeah, it literally, it took the Hatebreed model and went, no, we can make this way more about.
Bulldoze predates Hatebreed.
Yes, but you know what I mean, like, because the fast is not as important,
Right, and that is the wild thing about Bulldoze is like they actually have a lot of tempos, but like they go from like slow and then they hit you with slower, and then sometimes they hit you with slower. And then there's
but sometimes when we're talking about like these super ignorant riffs, it is literally minimalism in the mosh part. It's taking everything down to the base level of just, just smash, smash, smash.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
You probably described it like as accurate as possible when you're like, that someone's getting smashed no matter what, no matter who's there. Because it's like a lot of times like a beatdown show will be like, 20 kids in the crowd, but it's like, 6 of them
75-foot horseshoe.
Right. It's a giant horseshoe, and like there's definitely someone's in a crowd kill and you're going to get hurt, like more so than if there was like 50 people moshing.
Yes, definitely. And when the band is setting up and you see that ESP, you're like, uh-oh.
Yeah, you see ESP and a PV head.
I'm gonna
a crate fucking speaker. And you're like, oh shit, this is going to be some ignorant riffs.
Maybe some mesh shorts thrown in there.
Absolutely horrible.
Yeah, well, that's all subjective, Joe. I would, like, I think that like this is my personal opinion, but for like the big mosh bands and like the beatdown bands, like the ones that aren't, super standout, like most bands in that genre are pretty competent. That's
true. I will give you that.
Right. Where I think that there's other genres where like, there's such a wide spectrum between like the greats and the terrible, Youth Crew being easily able to look at as that, like the difference between a great Youth Crew band and a terrible one is like miles, where like beatdown bands, like, it's pretty close to the middle. Like there's not a lot of standard deviation.
Lots of good drummers in that world.
That's true. You know,
You got to get the
Chops.
shark double kick drum with the shark cage action. Do they do the shark cage? You know what I'm talking about? The rack that holds
The rack?
Okay.
Yeah.
dude,
I
that
always
is so
feel
ill.
I always feel like a lot of the beat down and Igno bands are the ones that have like, yo, my cousin knows this guy who's a good drummer, and he's just like some Juilliard dude that they just roped in, like, play this, make it sound more Neanderthal, and you can flourish on other parts of the song.
Right, but that
And
guy's stoked. It was like either play in that like band that can play shows and have dudes mosh, or play in a Metallica cover band.
Oh yeah, there's no disrespect to go into this genre. It fills up lots of my record collection.
Yeah.
And wear this basketball jersey that has an area code on it.
Yeah, I love basketball jerseys. Basketball jerseys and tank tops, like, they look good on every body type, in my opinion. You can be like a giant fat guy. You can be like a buff dude. You can be a skinny person. Like, everybody looks good. So bring it back. What's up? Bedge, do you feel like we've hashed out this topic enough, or do you have more you want to riff on?
No, I feel like ignorant riffs are well represented.
All right. Awesome.
And if anyone listening has any other, take on it,
some take on that,
be sure to let us know.
Yeah, and you should let us know like what the best ignorant riff band is, I guess.
Well, what the best ignorant riff is, just the riff. Like, let's narrow it down to one riff.
The king of igno riffs.
Yeah.
Yeah, dude. I'm with it. I want to know. Okay. Well, making a hard right turn to something else. It's another band topic. He was asking, do bands like TSOL, Adolescents, and the Zero Boys, who occupy the gray area between hardcore and punk, do they deserve their own genre description? And Ben, let me shoot it to you because I got to go close my windows.
Okay, so I'm actually working on an article right now about this very topic with Daniel Weitzman, who wrote for Flipside in the early 80s as Shredder, and he co-wrote the book Hardcore California, which came out in 1983. He was a published author at the age of either 16 or 17. So he's got a lot of years on me, but he loves the idea that most of these bands were like 1978 to 81 California bands. Zero Boys obviously influenced by that stuff. The idea that these bands, they kind of deserve their own genre designation. Like, they don't, like, hardcore kids look at them and they go, oh, those are punk bands. And then punk people look at them and they go, oh, those are hardcore bands. Like we don't want to claim them. And like, I think that they have like their own sort of, there are musical similarities between these bands to the point where I think like it's totally warranted to put them in the same box. And so, I came up with the term 1.5 because punk equals 1, hardcore equals 2, and these are the bands in between, like 1.5ers. And so, it's like the basically the problem that we're coming up with, we're talking about the history of a lot of these bands and how they kind of spread out throughout the United States and Canada, DOA and Canadian Subhumans being two of them as well. But like, the hardest thing to do is to try to figure out what the line would be between punk and this genre. 1.5 is what we're calling it. And then the line between 1.5 and hardcore. Like, where does one begin and the other one end? Like, obviously it gives us we have a greater area we now have a third category to throw bands into, but then we also have we have two more borders that we've created in doing so. So I don't know what you guys' take on it is. Do you think it's like a stupid idea and like all these bands should just be considered punk or hardcore and like, let's call it a day, or if there's anything like, worthy of, creating new terminology for all this?
Well,
Daniel, jump in.
Yeah, what I would say is it's always been a sliding scale, right? Many of the bands that we classify now potentially as being punk were hardcore at the time, termed hardcore, and it, as this thing of ours evolves and moves on, the subcategories within sometimes blend. It's almost like when people are putting animals into subcategories and whatnot, like an amphibian.
I thought you were just saying red meat, white meat. Hey, go vegetarian, people.
Yes. And it's just a sliding scale thing where at the time TSOL was, hardcore, but it was attracting punks, weirdos, new romantics, goths, because of the reference points and the makeup and just, they were the big thing too, that lots of people were coming around to go see. I think it is a really interesting question, but would these bands at the time have aligned themselves as being the same at the time? They may have thought they were very different from each other. You know what I mean?
Well, compared to the first wave of, like, let's say Los Angeles punk rock, like, it is hardcore punk for sure, right? Like, it's edgier, more aggressive. The crowds are more aggressive. The shows, from all reporting, are more aggressive.
Yeah.
But if you look at some of the stuff, like, the TSOL, the self-titled is like 81. The Zero Boys LP is 82. I know they have 7 inches that predate that. Comparing them, the Adolescents, I think, is 81. The first, the Blue LP. So if you're looking at those in the context of, like, are these punk bands, or are they hardcore bands? It's 1981. Well, the Minor Threat put out both their 7 inches in 81. So, like, if you're looking at a national level and comparing these bands sonically versus Minor Threat, Minor Threat is a faster band, and, like, that's kind of how I differentiate. Like, they have a faster beat. It's faster than, like, going, like, the more mid-tempo drivey beat. That's like the punk mid-tempo, like the Black Flag, the Ramones, whatever you want to say. And then you have the Bad Brains, The Roar comes out in 82, I believe. So 81, 82, like, these bands are playing fucking fast, compared to the bands that have been brought up in this topic that are playing still, like, aggressive, still hard, but more of a mid-tempo.
Yeah, but if you would see the difference between for example, a Clash or a Sex Pistols, right, playing and it being a lot more of what would be traditionally like a rock and roll band, but they are punk and they are changing things and they are kids that have no business being on stage compared to what was professional musicianship at the day, and that's what made punk, then it turns around and you look, a couple of years later, and TSOL are, like, aggressively in the face of the crowd and things like that. So it is a more hardcore approach than what went before, but obviously what's going on elsewhere can be faster. It doesn't mean that it has necessarily more aggression.
Yeah, I think it's a style thing too. These 1.5 bands were trying to say that they have the humor and the wit of punk and the aggression of what would become hardcore, but they also have the melody and the musicality of punk, and they also have the vocals aren't as screamed, the drum beats are more medium fast. They just fall right in the middle. And there's so much of it that falls right in the middle that, like, it's not like we created this genre to describe 3 bands. We're coming up with a list that's probably 75 to 100 records deep already. We're like, anytime we think of something, we write it down. And there's stuff like Naked Ray Gun that falls outside of that 78 to 81 window. Like, they're after that, but they would still be in line with the kind of 1.5, like, too hardcore to be punk, not hardcore enough to be hardcore type of, middle class, no pun intended. So I mean, I could read you off a million names like Marginal Man and Reagan Youth. Like, think about Reagan Youth. They put out that album in '84. Agnostic Front, Victim in Pain, same city, same year,
same
puts
show,
out that album, same shows, like total world of difference. We would say Reagan Youth would be a 1.5 band and Agnostic Front would be a hardcore band. Or like, think about the Wasted by Black Flag, and then the Circle Jerks cover that song, 2 years later, and they play it, twice as fast and shave 9 seconds off of a song that was already 49 seconds long. And it's like, there's the difference between 1.5 and hardcore right there. So,
and undoubtedly Red Tape, which is 1980, is a hardcore song, but then like, I just think that like by 82, it's like blown wide open, right? Because you have the Minor Threat 7-inch is 81, but Negative Approach is 82, that 7-inch, and like 83, it's wide open where there's like full hardcore bands. Like then you're looping in like, Ill Repute, 1983, Land of No Toilets, there's a whole like, it's nationwide now.
Totally. But I think there's that beginning stage of people kind of trying to figure this shit out. And like, even within a band's catalog, like Dead Kennedy's Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables, it's like a 1.5 record. But then, the next year they do In God We Trust Incorporated, and they have like Nazi Punks Fuck Off and Dog Bite and these really hard, fast, short songs. And it's like, okay, they've converted. This is hardcore now. There's no question about that. And like Black Flag Nervous Breakdown, 1.5, Black Flag Damage, hardcore. There are a few other ones like that are like Black Dots, the 79 demo by Bad Brains, 1.5, Roar Tape, hardcore. Like, you see the transition happen even within a given band's catalog. Like, it's a movement towards aggression and speed. But like that middle stage, like Social Distortion, Mommy's Little Monster, like seriously, depending on who you ask, they're going to put that record in a different category. Or they're going to judge a band based on what they ended up being as opposed to what they were at that point in time,
But I think that's what's happening when you look back and classify something as a 1.5 band, is you have the benefit of hindsight to look back and be historical and say, okay, we can group these things together and give it its own subclass because we saw what came after. At the time, I think many of them would have referred to themselves as hardcore, and many of them would have referred to themselves as punk. And frankly, like, I think all hardcore should be referred to as punk as well,
Absolutely.
Well, I
totally agree with that.
Well, I think that you can do a bigger umbrella and say hardcore punk, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think that would include like the 1.5s and like the straight hardcore bands we're talking about. And then later on, and moving into the next question, we're not going to go there yet, but at some point, you have bands that are just straight hardcore, and you have like a lot of the punk like stripping off, and not necessarily like there's still hardcore bands. Like, sonically, this music is going to change. They remain hardcore, but it would be hard to say that like Earth Crisis is a hardcore punk band.
I think it's all punk to me. Like, it is all punk, like, that's the thing. Like, we've had many discussions in the past, like, obviously it's hardcore first, but it's still punk. Like, punk is bigger than all of it.
Reading that Bad Religion book, they talk about their onset onto the scene in 1980, 81, and how the punk bands that existed prior to the quote unquote hardcore bands that you guys that we're talking about here were just TSOL, Bad Religion, whoever else in LA, especially in LA at that time. The difference was these other bands were art bands, and these other guys just came in along and weren't doing that same thing. There was no aesthetic piece to them. It was completely stripped down. So that's the other piece that we're not talking about. We're talking about fast music and we're talking about these other things, but the other thing is missing is that hardcore bands don't have that, the glitz and glitter stuff that was going on in punk rock at that time.
Right. There's no art school aesthetic. There's no pretension. It's more physical. It's more like surfer, skateboarder dudes going off and stage diving and stuff.
They're just stripped down.
Right. And that's totally the difference between punk and what we're calling 1.5. Like that transition has already happened at that point. The harder thing is figuring out like how fast does a band have to be before, or hard or whatever it is, like that before it's like we're clearly in hardcore territory. Like there are a lot of bands on the line, like that first Bad Religion album. Like where would you put that? Like it's not that different than the faster TSOL songs. Obviously, they were listening to the Germs and the Adolescents when they were writing those songs. Like they're by their own admission influenced by those bands. Like, LA's Wasted Youth, Reagan's In. Like that's one that Daniel's like, that's hardcore. That's where it starts to be like, obviously hardcore. And it's like it's not even that different than the other stuff we're talking about. So yeah, it's like a gradient. It's like if you're looking at a rainbow, there's you go red, orange, yellow. What's orange? It's a combination of red and yellow, and it lies in between the two. Like that's kind of what we're talking about. It's still a color, distinct color, but it's a blend of two other colors that make it that distinct color.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about hardcore, it's a blunter, more aggressive message, a blunter delivery and forgoing of melody in certain aspects. Like you have the choice to make something really melodic or not. That could be when we're talking in this time period, if you're trying to make it more, I don't know. It's so hard to define. Like I say, it's a sliding scale because at the time, like lots of it would have been categorized something else that with hindsight, it can be placed in another bucket.
I just think that, can't we agree it's under the hardcore punk umbrella and then that takes care of it? No?
Yeah.
I mean, in general terms, yeah.
But I mean, I do like the idea of the 1.5, but like, I think that the 1.5 is the stuff that I consider like the birth of hardcore punk, and I'm not above being completely wrong, but
call
that's
it
just
original
what I think.
hardcore, original hardcore or something.
Yeah. I mean, you could say first wave hardcore. I just think that the stuff that, Ben is tossing out here, thinking about, Minor Threat being there in 81, like there just is a sonic difference. And that goes back to, is the sonic thing important or not? Maybe it's not. And that's going to go into the next topic that we're going to talk about.
Well, think about it this way. Like if the Minor Threat, who do they consider their peers? Many, when they toured the country, like many of these bands would have been in that category. Is Fear
absolutely?
Is Fear a hardcore band? Is Fear a punk band? Is Fear a 1.5er?
Right. Like Daniel says, the best way to tell is if you don't know if a band is punk or hardcore, that's they're a perfect candidate for this middle category. If you can't answer that question yourself and you've been listening to this same band for 30 years and you don't know what category to put them in, like, okay, this is why we invented this, like here's a category that they finally fit into. Think about Harley Flanagan playing drums for the Stimulators in 1981. 1 year later, he's doing the Cro-Mags demo. Like that is a world apart. Like Stimulators 1.5, Cro-Mags hardcore, at least the very early stuff.
Yeah, but if Harley's involved within it, isn't it hardcore anyway?
Well,
because of the VHS. What's New York hardcore? It's me and him.
oh yeah.
Him and
Right,
Jimmy
right.
Gestapo. Can't argue with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I think that's the hardcore punk shit, and I love it. But let's talk about the next topic because it like plays into this as well, which is why is the goalpost on what qualifies as hardcore been moving in the metal direction for the last 30 years? Daniel, you want to take this first?
It goes back to the sliding scale thing. It's just a constant evolving, moving, throbbing, pulsating thing is hardcore. Like it builds off of what came before. So if something comes out and it captures a lot of attention and people get into it, they can't help but be influenced by it to go one step further and do something like that. And then, there's also pushback where things return to the roots. Like there's bands that sound like Minor Threat that are forming today, but there's also bands that sound like referential of a 90s metallic hardcore band. And then there's bands that are straight up creating their own version of whatever they assume hardcore to be, and it is going to have a metal tinge to it, or it could perhaps be this. I just think when hardcore, it almost touches on the Igno topic that we started with, when there's almost like a competitive streak running through hardcore, that when you're influenced by something and you want to make it the most like boiled down version of something that you've been influenced by. So if something you were influenced by was pretty metallic edged, then whatever you come up with and you're boiling what you really loved about it down, then it will be super metal. And then the next thing will be influenced off of what you did and like magnify that even more. So that's probably why it's going in that direction as a whole, sound wise. But I don't think the entire thing is bands are being more and more like that. I just think there's lots more bands, and then the pushes to the edge are going further and further. Like some hardcore stuff is being very D-beat and crust influenced and going really hard in that direction. Some of it's going really hard and stretching the boundaries on the metal side, and then some is going on the most basic, like fast pissed, thrashed out hardcore. Like, so I don't think it's necessarily all going in a metal direction. I just think that if you hear something that is insanely metal, it's going to make you think like, well, is this still hardcore? If your sensibility is more on a Minor Threat level,
Right.
Well, the boundaries are going to get pushed, right? As time moves forward. And so if you start to think about like how things progress in the 80s, there aren't that many bands that can put out very similar records multiple times and have them all be awesome. Like if your name is not Poison Idea, right? Like they're like the only ones that can do it, So inevitably, if you're going to try to get harder than the stuff that is your contemporaries or what's going on right then, it might go in a more metal direction because like metal stuff sounds hard and tough, right? Or it could go in the faster direction. And so you see a lot of bands that go, crossover in metal, like around the 86 time, and probably trace that to like AF Cause for Alarm. I'll talk about that in a second. But you also have like a couple years later, the Infest and the Crossed Out and these bands like that just go full in on like speed, right? Just like, let's write the fastest, most insane shit you can ever do.
Right.
Yeah. And right now there's a lot of bands that are picking up UK 82 as an influence, and riding hard on that. Hardcore is full of trends too. You're going to notice if you don't like metal, and this is directed to Ben, if you don't like metallic hardcore, you're going to notice that there's lots of metallic hardcore bands out there that are getting a lot of attention because you don't consider that as much hardcore because of your sensibility. But it doesn't, I just think every aspect of like that makes up what we love about hardcore, like the fast stuff, the metal stuff, blah blah blah, it's all expanding. It's just you're noticing the thing that you don't like as much.
But the goalpost has moved. Like if you took a hyper fast band from 2020 and teleported them back to 1983, you know, they would still be considered a hardcore band. If you took super, where we go,
sorry,
ahead.
Ben, go ahead. I was just going to say that you can't expand on that genre of very basic 3 to 4 chord, fast as fuck hardcore. Like you can't be super inventive, and that's why we love it. Like it's not going to change like insanely. Like you're going to be rooted in that, but also the things that are influenced by A Life Full of Regret, and then going further on that, and then the next generation's going even further on that. That can change because there's more ground not trod there, you know.
Yeah, my theory was
Ben's point though is like take something like okay, I love that Coke Bust LP, you know, and they're non-metallic, but they have like a lot of like blast beats and stuff. And so Ben's saying if you take that band and transport it back to like 84, it's still a hardcore band, but take
Knocked Loose.
Yeah, fine. Take Knocked Loose and put it in 84. It's definitely like a metal band, right? I think if that's fair, because that's like an out of context way of doing it. But if you look at the progression makes sense, because I think it's just I think you got to trace it back to AF doing Cause for Alarm in 1986. This is like a crossover record, so it's like very like close to doing like speed metal, you know, but it's also Agnostic Front, so it's inherently a hardcore record. Like they could do anything sonically, and Agnostic Front is going to be hardcore.
Yeah, because they're hardcore people. That's the main thing that's not been addressed. The reason that these metallic bands are going more and more hardcore, it's still hardcore kids doing this music. So if
that's part of what drives me nuts, though. It's like it shouldn't matter who you are. You're playing music. Judge the music on the music. Don't judge it on the haircut of the person playing it, or the clothes they're wearing, or the fact that they were in a hardcore band before, or the last album was hardcore. Like, no, like listen to the music. And what kind of music is that? Like, you know what I mean? Like
that's the intangible.
Though. Yeah. That's
way more than music.
That's right. That's the intangible thing that's impossible to put your finger on.
So is Civ a hardcore band then?
Yeah.
What?
They were.
Oh God.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know him at the time. It depends on what your intentions are as well, right?
I think I actually wrote out my theory because I actually thought about this question a couple hours ago, and it's very similar to Dan's. I have like 2 points I wanted to make. Like, one is you can only play so fast. You're limited by physics. Like your arms can only move so fast. So if you're playing that game that the Neos and Deep Wound and a lot of those 83 era bands played with each other, where they're trying to outspeed each other, like you're going to reach an endpoint. But then when people started pushing it in the heavy direction, there's like no limit to that. Like there's no one's ever going to agree, but no one's ever going to be like, that's it. Heaviness achieved.
Well, you can't drop tune. You can't drop tune past a certain level, right? Like B or
I'm sure someone figured out how to go to A. Falling off.
Yeah, but they make like strings that like help. But yeah, you can only down tune so low. You can only get a certain amount of like distortion out of an amp. Like there's an end on that too.
You can objectively figure out who's playing the fastest beat. Like that, you can just set a metronome to it and figure out this guy's going 300 BPM. That's it. Like this is the fast. Like there's no like heaviness is more subjective. Like I think Black Sabbath Volume 4 is heavy. That's really really thin by today's production standards. Even though there's something kind of there's this kind of je ne sais quoi. Like there's something that you can't an intangible about it. So when people got hyper focused on the mosh part of the song, it reached the point where entire songs became mosh parts. I mean, listen, like, I mean, Breakdown is starting to go there by Earth Crisis. You're like, this band doesn't have any fast parts. Like, and then the other point I wanted to make is that like every generation of hardcore kids who got a little bit better at their instruments looked to metal for inspiration because it's a more technical style of music. And then they built on top of itself over years and years to the point where the music was no longer identifiable as the thing it started out as, which happens with every genre. But I think that's the reason it got pushed in the metal direction. And then you started getting kids who got into hardcore music through metal instead of getting into hardcore through punk, which is how it was back when hardcore was essentially extremely fast and brutal sounding punk. Yeah. I shouldn't use the word brutal, but you get what I'm saying, like the first generation. And so like, who's going to gatekeep those igno punk? Who's going to gatekeep a kid who got into hardcore through metal and be like, and started being in a band and say like, no, what you're doing is metal. That shit isn't pure. Like there's no way to gatekeep that. And there's no such thing. Like there's no referee in hardcore. There's no referee in hardcore. Not punk though. Yeah, exactly. So like the whole thing just got pushed further into that direction. And like, obviously, like Dan was saying, like non-metal influenced hardcore has a lane. Like there was a point in the 90s where it didn't. Like early 90s kind of Victory era, like, you know, people who were like me who were into the fast shit were hurting. Like, you know, the Minor Threat aesthetic, there was like we were playing the waiting game. And so like that has its own lane now, but metal in general just metal, the genre of music, is more popular than punk or traditional hardcore. And so like metal, I don't see metal free hardcore being like the majority again. Like if you look at every band that calls themselves hardcore in 2020, like I believe the majority of them are of the metallic varietal. And like you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Like I don't see a way that's ever going to reverse.
No, it's not. And hardcore is going to continue to grow in every direction, you know, worldwide. The thing is, like, going back to your thing about people with chops, especially like leaning towards the metallic side of things, there's only so much if you're really, really wanting to push things further and wanting to demonstrate your ability within the songs that you write. You couldn't do that much in a straightforward hardcore sense of things per se compared to what you could do in a metallic thing, you know. That's why there's so many great guitar players in the kind of crossover genre, because their heart bleeds pure hardcore, but they can shred. Shout out Greg.
Right. Totally.
You know? Yep. Everyone wants to be Rocky George there. Yeah. So,
well, that's the other thing though, is like with, you know, if you want to prove your chops in metal, like good luck. It's been like that stuff's there. You can really like carve out a niche if you move away from it. You know,
I'm saying that's why the crossover genre is so that lane, you know?
Yeah, I think that's fair. But I mean, you have a band like the One Step Closer band, right? Like that band's really talented, and they're putting a lot of, you know, tricks and unique stuff into relatively straightforward hardcore songs.
Well, like Tragedy.
Well, yeah, that too. You know? Yeah. Tragedy is a great example of being really creative and having chops and like carving out a niche, like away from metal. Like it's there.
Yeah, of course.
And also like
damn heavy.
Yeah, they're heavy. That's true. I mean, they're drop tuned. But I think that like these modern times are like the best time for hardcore, period. Like depending on what you like, there's stuff for you. Like multiple bands will like satisfy all your itches.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think that's what's fantastic about being able to look back and have these really nerdy questions that we're putting up, because we're not like seriously trying to solve the chicken or the egg debate, you know. It's more just like these are interesting conversations because we're so spoiled with so many genres and so many great bands that we can look at these things on an empirical sense and be like, okay, so why is this happening and what is the reason behind it? And, you know, it just offers up ways to, for lack of a better term, intellectualize punk and hardcore, because it is such a wonderful thing to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, and it all just boils down to that Bedge hates metal, and he's pissed off that he missed Instead by about 6
He's
months.
Ronnie Little. And Ronnie Little is just sat behind him, like poking him, like, "Hey, say this next."
Yeah. He didn't have the outlet of "fuck you" fanzine, so he's just been he's been boiling this entire time, and now it's so. But yeah, I mean, Ben, if you think about, you did a great list on the end of the 2020 episode, back when we did that, and your list for the year was like 30 fucking bands,
right?
So it's like the good guys won. Hardcore rules now.
Well, there was some metallic shit in there too. I mentioned Mind Force and Take Offense.
Yeah.
So but like, even if I loved metallic hardcore across the board, this is a good question to ask. Like, the goalpost has moved in the more metal direction. Like, there's no way to deny that,
No, I mean, I'm agreeing with that.
So much more subgenre that can be done within there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's just what the kids want to hear too, right? Yeah. That's also where that goes. It's like people want to hear that style, and so people are going to play, provide that kind of music.
There will always be trends, and there will always be themes,
and that's not a bad thing either. I'm not trying to talk shit about that. I just think that's what kids are into,
Joe, when you sit around and talk shit about something that you once believed in.
Shut up,
your whole life on.
Yeah, but no, I mean, also the thing is, like, the progression of things and music changing, it also creates the atmosphere for throwback stuff.
Yeah.
And for like those genres to like pop again, and for people to rediscover them and love them.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
No, I mean, like, why was Floor Punch so great when they came out? Why did that like catch such fire, and like create this wave of bands and fans of that music,
because it was an underrepresented style of hardcore at that time.
But it wouldn't have been so big if there was like, 8 bands playing that genre the whole way through from like 91 until 95.
There's also one extra little intangible that we choose not to look at because it goes against the very thing that we talk about as being punk and hardcore. But if a band full of popular kids does popular kids within the scene does a band, it's gonna be liked. Perhaps, like, people are gonna flock to it. Sometimes it takes something to be lost and forgotten to be then resurrected and championed, whereas it wasn't appreciated during the time. And other times, bands that were huge at the time were because, people love those dudes and girls, and sometimes it doesn't hold up, long time on. So sometimes trends and themes get pushed in a certain way because of who's doing it as well,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think stuff falls out of favor too, because also, those bands you're talking about, then, some kids hear that and then they create,
the next version. Yeah.
The next version, which becomes popular enough to get on the radio and then becomes, this, mega trend. I'm talking like screamo stuff or, that stuff, because that's still got ties back to hardcore.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
bring me the horizon and things.
Yeah,
like that.
That's stuff. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And then what happens is people rebel against that stuff eventually. Like, no, this is it's not right. We can't. It's the wrong thing to listen to.
It gets shunned. It gets shunned by the hardcore, but then it develops its own weird offshoot scene.
Yeah,
where almost teeny bopper. Stuff happens and it develops its own thing. The social history of this kind of stuff is fascinating. I feel, how things happen like that, and the signposts where it changed. And like Ben said, what are the bands that started this, that moved the goalpost? But it's happening in a minute way all the time. It's always evolving.
Yeah, well, I want to address like that some things can go the other way of of what Joe's talking about, of like some bands getting popular, you know, like the bands that like get influenced by this, they take it, they turn it into something new, they get popular, then there's a backlash against it. It can go the other way as well. Like the Youth Crew stuff we were talking about in the 90s, like a lot of that initial stuff is good. And the stuff that doesn't, you know, the stuff that comes later, like there is so much third rate bad stuff there.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
If you look at, we did like the 90s of Youth Crew, and it's like, you know, the early 90s is really barren, you know, and like 95, 96, everything that gets mentioned, we're like, this stuff rules. But by like 98, 99, there's like a ton of records we had to leave off because there's just so much third rate, terrible, like derived music that like, you know, it's just a slew of mediocrity in a music that cannot afford to be mediocre. And then people are just like, okay, time for something new. You know,
well, that's what makes the great bands of those. That's what makes the great bands of the purer, what we would consider pure hardcore, you know, like initial stuff that is at least based in that world, because you have less room to move. So when you do it really, really well, you capture everyone.
right?
But if
and
you
like
do
a
it
couple of your picks
poorly,
were like that
it's like
yeah, a
great.
couple of your picks were like great examples of that, Daniel, for the 2020, like that Rat Cage record, that Rated X. Like these are bands that are in the straightforward hardcore lane that like do an amazing job.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why the early 80s is so great, because hardcore was new. So you had so many bands that didn't really, like Dead Kennedys don't sound anything like Black Flag, but they're both hardcore by 81. You know, so and then you have like Big Boys and Minor Threat and like all these bands that sound nothing like each other, but they're all clearly playing the same general style of music. And then it seems like every one of those bands, like a lane formed, and then you have Minor Threat copycats, and then you have you know, Black Flag copycats, and then, you know, it just branches out further and further and further, and it gets kind of in many respects less interesting, because then you can have a show where you could see 5 bands that are pretty much all sound like the same band, you know, that they're all trying to sound like. So I think that happens with every genre of music.
For sure. Okay. Do we feel like that got represented well enough, Ben?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. You brought up this one as well. When hardcore bands signed to major labels, was it good for hardcore? Was it good for the bands? Was it good for the labels? And what was the success rate? And you bring this up because I believe you're working on an article about this that may be published by the time that this podcast comes out. So maybe you want to toss out some examples, Ben.
Yeah, so I'm working on an article with Anthony Papalardo, who was in 10 Yard Fight and In My Eyes.
Or possibly worked on an article.
Yeah, well, he wrote that book, Radio Silence, about hardcore music, maybe like 10 years ago. So the article, well, we haven't really written it yet, but we've done a lot of research, and a friend of the pod, Mike Gitter, has been very helpful because he's actually given us sound scan numbers. So when we don't have to like kind of pretend we know how well Civ did when they signed to Atlantic Records. Like we literally know how many copies like each record sold. So like we can kind of figure out more concretely how well these bands did when they ended up signing to majors. And like I think the question is usually posed from like an article in MRR would be like, this is destroying the scene and all this. It's like major labels don't have the same power that they used to have. They're I wouldn't say the playing field's been leveled, but it's changed enough where like it doesn't really, like, people don't really give a shit if like a band like Jawbreaker signs to Geffen anymore, the way they did in the 90s. So we're only discussing the 80s and the 90s bands. But I don't think it made much of a difference for hardcore, because most of these bands, by the time they ended up on major labels, they didn't sound like hardcore bands anymore. Sick of It All is a notable exception. And like, they played the Warped Tour. Like, I saw them at the first Warped Tour, and it's like maybe some bros like who wouldn't have seen Sick of It All like saw them and thought they were okay. Like, I just don't think it moved the needle in any direction for hardcore for the most part. But like, was it good for the bands? I'd say, in other words, did they make the right choice by signing to a major label? Did the label hold up its end of the deal, and did they actually sell a lot of records? And like, you know, in some cases they did, in some cases they didn't. But I think like the failure rate has been exaggerated. Like, there's this famous Steve Albini article where he's like, if you sign to a major label, you're gonna, like, you know, it's a terrible idea, and like you're never gonna be successful. And it's like, well, you know, Suicidal Tendencies have 2 gold records on Epic. Social Distortion has 2 gold records. Bad Religion has a gold record. They were on Atlantic. The Meat Puppets, obviously they weren't a hardcore band by the time they signed to London Records, but they have a gold record. And like a lot of mid-tier bands like Husker Du and Quicksand and Biohazard did really well too. Like, they didn't go gold or anything. And like, yeah, there were duds like Excel, Circle Jerks, No Warning, Into Another. Like, those bands did, like, they failed at the major label game. But like, overall, most bands, regardless of genre, are going to fail. Like, that's the success rate is always a fraction of the number of bands that get signed to majors. It's always been that way. They say the winners pay for the losers. So like these labels, like by 91 or 92, they were like looking for the next Nirvana. So like all these punk and hardcore bands got scooped up, and they never found the next Nirvana. Like, I can't think of any band that did as well as them, but like some of these bands did do pretty well. So like, I just don't think that they did worse. Like, these hardcore bands did worse than, you know, Joe Blow rock band who, you know, never made a record before and doesn't belong to any like subculture did. I think it's probably about the same success rate.
Yeah, well, because the hardcore bands are inherently good. That's why they got on like the label, right? You're generally not getting like signed to a major off a demo if you're a hardcore band. Like the established bands that sounded good got signed to majors sometimes, you know? So we're
right
compared to the Joe Blow band, you know, like there could be A&Rs like cruising around the bar scene where literally bands are like, you know, they're creating a band to try to get famous, you know, and there's no heart to it. And, you know, an A&R maybe can recognize that, maybe can't, but is going to take a chance on signing them. Right.
Right. Like a lot of these bands had like established track records, you know, like All, for example, had like, I don't know, 4 or 5 albums out before Interscope picked them up. And they didn't do well at all. I'm looking at the numbers right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, the worst
name
example,
any band, I'll tell you.
Well, the worst example, I don't know if we should. Well, okay, whatever. But the worst example though is Sam I Am, right? Didn't they have an album Iced? Like that's the major label like nightmare, you know, to like record a record and have the label decide to not put it out, and they own the rights to it. So that's like the big major label fear.
They had one album on Atlantic. Friend of the pod, Mike Gitter, signed them to Atlantic, and it didn't do very well. And then they had another album on some weird label called Ignition that kind of didn't last very long. And yeah, they didn't do very well.
But when did the album come out? Like compared to when it was recorded, I think that's the question. But like again, I couldn't like. We don't need to answer a question that we don't have an answer for.
But the thing is,
I just remember them being like the scary worst case scenario. Like they get signed to a major, the major controls your music, and they decide to not put the record out. You know, and it has
Sensefield, that happened to Sensefield. Maybe you're thinking of Sensefield. They signed to Warner Brothers, and they recorded a whole album for them, and Warner Brothers was like, "We don't hear a hit," and they didn't. They just sat on it for years and years. Yeah, that happened to them.
Right, or like like this is not hardcore at all, but I remember watching this documentary on Warrant, the band, and like when they did the second album, Cherry Pie, I guess like the label's like, hey, there's no hit on this, and they made them do the song Cherry Pie, and Janie Lane, like the singer, he was like crying about it on the documentary. He's like, I don't want to be known as the Cherry Pie guy. You're like, we got other good tracks, but it's like the label like forced them to do that song to put out the record.
He's dead now, so
yeah.
And R.I.P. Cherry Pie guy.
Yeah,
there are like nightmare scenarios, of course. but there are also scenarios like Husker Du who were like, we're not going to sign to Warner Brothers unless in the contract it says you can't fuck with our music. We create everything. We have 100% creative control. We determine what our record covers look like, everything. And it's like, Warner was like, okay, like fine. And so, it's not like you go in there with your hands tied. So everyone has had different experiences with this. But I read this article in Punk Planet from 20 years ago, and it's almost like they intentionally picked bands that had horrible situations happen to them on major labels to prove a point, as opposed to just be like, let's just think of every band from the scene.
They had a point.
Yeah, but like, let's try to be a little bit objective about this and just think of every band.
They didn't have the time to be objective. They felt their scene was under attack by this happening, because it's a very different time than looking back at it now and going, well, things blah blah blah. At the time, like Jawbreaker signing to a major and things like that were mega bum outs to those, other hardworking bands in the scene, where it's like, okay, well, now you're gonna get access to all of this stuff, but you're going to lose the access to these small rooms now, because not tons of people are going to go with you. And then it's interesting, like, Sick of It All never changed who they were. And so and New York, because of the Cro-Mags and other things like that, seemed to, in certain rooms or venues or enclaves of hardcore across the scene in general, different attitudes were taken in different areas. Do you know what I mean? Like, for the bands that came from extremely working class, hard-nosed hardcore scenes, signing to these labels was seen as like, yeah, man, way to fucking go. Like, that rules. Whereas in other areas, like if you were an ABC No Rio band instead of a CB's band, signing to a major would have been like, you stabbed us in the back, fuck you.
Or a Gilman band.
Exactly. But I was saying two New York venues to say that there are two different enclaves of hardcore kids happening in the same thing, even though many of the kids who were into those bands are going to both venues. But the bands that were playing the other venues really didn't cross. Do you know what I mean?
Everyone can Google the Think of It All Born Against debate.
Yeah.
And see how that played
and
out.
I don't think hardcore had that crossover moment the way punk did, like with Green Day and Offspring and Rancid in 94, 95. Like, there was never a point where it was like, maybe I guess you could say in the 2000s, like that kind of mall screamo type stuff, there were people who I guess thought that was hardcore. I mean, obviously you can trace a direct line from hardcore to it, but you don't have, like, Sick of It All did moderately well, but they did not become a household name the way Green Day did. So you didn't see the impact of that on hardcore as a whole.
But their next record was on Fat anyway, right? So
right, they ended up going back to an independent label.
Yeah.
Well, by then those indies were like pretty established, right? It's like, Madball was on a major for 3 albums and they went to Epitaph, but by 2000 Epitaph is like super legit. It's not like going to Epitaph in 91. Same with like, Sick of It All going to Fat. Like, Fat is a well-oiled,
Oh yeah.
The thing Sick of It All is achieving by going to Relativity and doing this in the 90s is the ability for a label to support them to be on the road, to make this a lifestyle choice, to be a professional band. It's not necessarily to go, I mean, I don't think any of them had delusions of grandeur to be like, we're going to sell 1 million records. Like, even whatever A&R person blew smoke up their ass, it's more like, we get to do this and not have to work a day job and play hardcore all the time. Yes, I'm going to do that. So
right.
Whether you talk about success in record sales, that's a success for them to have carved out a life career in playing the music that they love, you know?
Yeah, Daniel, you're right. And so
Yeah.
I think a great example of this is if you go and listen to the podcast episode I did with Dave Mandel, he talks about what it costs to, like, as a label, to try to support a full-time touring band, because Ensign was trying to tour full-time. And Dave is their label that put out like the album. Like, he just talks about like the financial expenses of always like fronting money is like hard for a smaller indie at the time, you know? So that really plays to Daniel's point of having Sick of It All with like a major label behind them that can front a lot of money, like, so they can rent a bus, you know, et cetera, and tour comfortably so they can tour more, you know, like it makes sense.
Yeah, but then they have to do things like this. Sick of It All had to take Korn on that tour as part of their label, saying, yeah, we're giving you the tour support to go do this nationwide tour, but you've got to bring this band with you.
Right.
You know?
Right.
You know,
Right.
They got to open for Slayer.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, at the Ventura Theater. Didn't go over so well.
There's a great Immortal
It went
Technique
over.
line on the indie labels on one of his songs. I think it's on the second record, when he goes, "Underground labels know that I don't trust you. You're only indie till you're major, so fuck you." You know, it's
Yeah.
like, that's another thing. It's like, at least the majors, you know what you're dealing with. You know, I mean, get a lawyer and shit, but you know, there's a lot of indies. It's like, you're on an indie label and they sell. You know, it's like you got. What are you getting then?
Well, if you know you're going to sell the same amount of records regardless of what label you're on, it's better to be on an indie because there's lower overhead. Like, if a major label throws more money at you, the stakes are higher. You have to sell more records to recoup. And like in the case of Bad Religion, I think they do have a gold record that whatchamacallit, Stranger Than Fiction. But like every other record, it seems like no matter if they were on Epitaph or Atlantic, they still would have sold about a little under 200,000 copies per. Oh no, they actually. Well, somewhere between 150 and 300,000 copies, no matter what. So it made sense for them to go back to Epitaph.
Right, because like they're getting a couple bucks a copy compared to $1.50 a copy or something.
Let's take it all the way back. This is not hardcore, but take it back to factory records, right? They made a decision to be a complete independent label and split the profits 50-50, label and band, right? No other label in the world is giving that deal. So that's the birth of where all these independent labels look to represent the artist as much as ever, especially if Brett Gerowitz is, doing the label. He's going to look out for his own band more than getting 10% of the record sales or whatever their royalty rate would be on Atlantic.
Right.
Yeah.
And you see that's evident because like you have, you know, older, bigger artists like Tom Waits, and isn't Nick Cave, didn't they both end up on Anti? Tom Waits did for sure.
Yeah, they both did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there you are. But Epitaph at this point is independent, but it's a stability of, there's probably more stability than a major. You know, it's like the golden spot if you can land there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, here's the thing. Think about it this way, right? You just brought up the way that this can kind of be looked at in a hip hop sense by Immortal Technique. But let's think about the fantastic line from the Jizza where he talks about who's your A&R, a mountain climber that plays electric guitar. It's the same thing for a hardcore band. You've got these A&Rs and there may have been an ex-hardcore band. There may be one person in the label that you like, Ben's friend, is signing people. But for the most part, that entire structure does not know how to handle a hardcore band, period. It's not the world of hardcore. The intangibles cannot be transmitted. So in essence, they're all doing themselves a disservice by going there, except for the thing that we said about being able to, there are a few bands that are able to access the rooms that built them still by doing that. There are many others that switched off that tap the minute they did sign that. Like, no, you can't come back. You can't play for us. Or even if you try to, we're not coming to the show. Do you know what I mean?
But as far so let's I want to do one exercise as an example, and then we'll move on from this topic. But Madball puts out Set It Off in what, 94 and 94, 95, one of those. What's 94. The difference if Madball puts out their record on Century Media versus they put it out on Victory? Like, does the popularity of the band change? Do the album sales change? What? Because they're a band that they played a lot, like locally, I believe, but I think that they did one US tour off that record, and I don't know how many times they went to Europe. But I don't think the popularity changes much, does it?
Yeah, I think with a band like Madball, like they're so established that it matters less what label they're on. Like they have their fans, they're going to sell a certain amount no matter what. It's more like the bands that are kind of like trying to introduce themselves to the world that it matters more, like how they're perceived initially, like what label they're on. I don't know. That's my opinion on that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on. And the next topic we got is, how is hardcore different if Youth of Today never existed? That was mine. I'm super, super curious about this one, and it's more so I just want your guys' opinion because I don't know. But they just seem like such a super influential band that, like, you know, Ben, you talked about when you were in Europe and like everyone had like the poster on the wall of like the first time they went there, you know, and they just seem so inspirational for bands here, you know, as like, you know, the next generation, like lighting the torch of like the straight edge hardcore scene that like I don't know, they just seem so important. I wonder like, what is it like in a world without them? And Ben, let's go to you.
That actually on Where It Went, they were talking to Porcell. Actually, maybe it was another podcast. I heard him on a lot of podcasts lately, but he basically explained that like the first time Youth of Today toured the country was 86, maybe. And there wasn't a straight edge scene per se. They were playing hardcore punk shows, hardcore shows, whatever, with other bands, you know, all kinds of bands, Adrenaline Overdose, whatever. And then by the time they toured the US again, which I guess would have been 87, they had been so charismatic and popular and they on trend or whatever that all these bands had formed in their wake. And then there was a straight edge scene, and they were playing with basically bands that sounded like them. They were playing with what we now call youth crew bands. And like, I think if they had never existed, that scene would never exist. Like straight edge would be an idea. Like there'd be hardcore punk kids who'd be like, I don't drink, I'm straight edge. Like that, obviously Minor Threat, like that was already, you know, a thing that was established at that point. So there would still be that, but I don't think there would be a straight edge scene. I don't think there would be 6 bands that were all straight edge bands, like completely existing in their own bubble, playing shows together, you know, in any given city. And like, the other thing that wouldn't exist is that there wouldn't be, you know, 600 bands that sound like Youth of Today. If Youth Crew had never existed, you wouldn't have those bands that have that Youth Crew fast part with the tribal tom heavy mosh part breaking up the fast parts, and then the sing-alongs where everyone points their finger and then adds the word fucking, you know, in the middle of a word, like breaks a word apart and puts fucking in the middle of it. Like that wouldn't exist. So you have like the whole early rev sound would be gone or just wouldn't exist. And then the straight edge scene wouldn't exist. But I still think you'd have the same ratio of metallic hardcore to metal free hardcore, because both those things were already in full swing before Youth of Today came on the scene. Like the crossover thing was already happening.
Okay, but then to follow up your thought before we go back and get Dan and Joe's original thought on that, does a band like Earth Crisis get to thrive if there's not that well-established like straight edge scene already?
No, I don't think they would.
So then inherently, like, do you not have that whole like metal explosion? Like, is everything different? Like, just not only taking away that, like, you know, there's no Judge, obviously, because they started they're inspired like by feelings on a Youth of the Day tour, You know, like you don't have them. You have Project X probably. But like, yeah, do you not have the stuff that comes after like that? I don't know. It's really interesting to think about. Dan, what do you think on this initially?
The question of what would hardcore be like without them?
Yes.
I mean, it's impossible to say, but I mean, I agree with the pathway of the reason. Let's break this down initially. The reason that they are so influential and reverential is the fact that they write good songs, period. That's awesome. But they would come to your town and blow you away. Like the minute, like the Eric Ozine interview on 185 Miles South, everyone listen to that. The thing is, someone will see them and be like, I have to fall in line with that. I have to, worship at the church of this. There's how many old aging youth crew kids do we know that Ray Capo can do nothing wrong in their eyes, regardless of being a 7-timer or whatever, because the charisma and the ability to fucking just put on an amazing hardcore show and do everything is there. But then youth of today were organizers of scenes and zines and bands, and the beginning of Revelation is Capo with Jordan doing everything. They were organizers just as much as they were blowing people away. Do you know what I mean? So they were cultivating their scene, they were pushing it forward and taking it across the world. So yeah, I can't imagine a world without it and where we would have gone. It's too big of a giant Easter Island head of hardcore in our thing to imagine without it. Like,
right. Does Rev start if they're not like the juggernaut that they are? And then also
no.
What is inspiring? Like Uniform Choice, like tours a little too late, to like inspire the entire country, and then a lot of the Rev bands don't come out if they would have even existed without Youth of Today. Like how many like pound the paper?
Half of them are in all of the bands. Right. Do you know what I mean? Like,
right. Like, would it have started organically anyway, or does a band like Instead like end up being way more influential and popular? And
does Instead happen without Youth of Today?
No, I think
in the way Instead is. I don't know. It's intent. It's completely it's completely mind bending to try and imagine it. But I do love tracing all the streams that come off it to show what helped. Like I love that put in the Earth Crisis, because I mean, you look at all those early straight edge, vegan edge metal bands, they're all wearing YOT and Turning Point and whatever shirts, because that's what they were into.
No more.
Going further, so, and lots of people say, like, and Ben, I think, just said it, like, straight edge was waning on a national scale of people realizing what it was or adhering to it. It needed some other charismatic thing to come along and put its stamp on it to get everyone like, yeah, that is a fucking rad way to be,
Yeah.
Maybe Uniform Choice would be thought of as more important than they already are. Like they're they're waving the flag for straight edge. If Youth of Today doesn't exist, I mean, they'd be the band, and so maybe you'd get more bands that sound like UC and Minor Threat, and less, obviously, no bands that sound like Youth of Today.
Okay, well, UC definitely influences Instead, right? So you have that,
absolutely.
But when Mike Gitter was on the Patreon pod for the Uniform Choice, the Pat Longry episode, he was saying that possibly a lot of the success for by the time the Uniform Choice toured they did all those East Coast and middle of the country dates with Youth of Today, and Youth of Today was already on fire by then, so like, I don't know, is Uniform Choice touring in 87, when he's talking about it's the Where Are the Bald Guys tour, and people being like, what is this? Like still being stoked, but maybe like it just not being what it was in 85 or 86. I don't know if Uniform Choice like creates the same fire, with
you're probably right.
Definitely not.
Probably right.
And
Straight edge just wouldn't be as big of a deal if Youth of Today hadn't been around, and there'd be a lot less colored vinyl.
Yeah, Joe, do you have an opinion on this? And then also, I just want to say, like, I do enjoy, even if you're not talking a lot, I feel like you're in the corner with like a club, and if we step out of line, like you're there to smack us.
I think all the threads that you guys talk about, if Youth of Today doesn't exist, all of those things certainly disappear. But I think the time was primed for something like that to happen, no matter what. Because of all the tough guy fight bullshit that was happening, like people wanted something positive. So it might not be Youth of Today, and it might sound completely different, and there might be no Revelation, and we might not get Earth Crisis and metalcore and all that stuff, or or we might get it. I mean, it's really hard to say. But I think I just remember, those days, Uniform Choice, and there were a few other straight edge bands, that, I mean, they might not have made a huge impact, Walk Proud and, a few of those other guys. I think the California scene would have happened regardless of Youth of Today.
Yeah, because maybe, I agree. Because you're
but certainly not the impact that we're talking about here.
But national impact.
But maybe it does happen. Maybe they become, like you said, maybe they become the catalyst that carries that message back east, and and then we get this whole other thing coming out of New York and Boston and DC, more from DC.
Well, just Youth of Today, like they scratch both itches, right? Because I read somewhere once that like their mission statement was basically like take the 7 seconds message with like the agnostic front, victim in pain, like sonicness,
power,
and it's like those two meshed up are so fucking special, where like if you think about instead sonically, it's very in the 7 seconds lane, but it doesn't have like that gnarly aggression, and the other bands doing it, like America's Hardcore just does a demo, Justice League, their sound like evolves on every record, but I think Chain of Strength still is going to happen, regardless of Youth Today. Ben, what do you think about that? Because Chain of Strength is going to come out off of UC and instead, right?
I don't think they would have sounded the way they ended up sounding, but there would have those guys were already playing in bands, so they would have, let's say they all played in a band together, and they probably wouldn't be called Chain of Strength, Youth of Today. I don't know. Like it just, they are absolutely a rev band. Like obviously they're influenced by other things too, like Boston and DC, but they are a rev band, so their sound would have been different. Those guys still would have been playing in bands in the Inland Empire, and still would have been making, I believe, very good records. But it wouldn't be what it ended up being.
Okay, I think that this has been touched on, and this is just so fascinating because, there's big early ones you can do. Like, what if Minor Threat never existed? What if Batteries never existed? What if Ramones, Sex Pistols, whatever? But this one's just so weird because it's later. It's like it's 8 years after 77.
They have a global footprint.
Yeah, I mean, like, yeah, and we're just basically talking in American terms. I brushed initially on the European thing, but like we don't really have that perspective. But they're like obviously super influential over there, probably, like building the groundwork for hardcore bands to be able to like go over there successfully for generations to come after, right? I mean, like
Right.
you think about bands like, well, I mean, lots of them, but Ignite in the 90s, like basically being successful in Europe more so than here, and I'm sure Sick of It All, Agnostic Front, all the big New York hardcore bands. I mean, maybe that probably would have happened organically just based on Agnostic Front, So I don't know if we can give credit to Youth Today for that, but they're definitely like another pillar of that post, like building this hardcore lane for American bands to tour Europe.
Yeah, they're the second most influential straight edge band ever.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. Okay, let's go on to the next one. This one's hard, and I don't have an answer. But who's the most underrated hardcore band in history? And no honorable mentions. Everyone gets one pick, and you got to make a convincing argument. And Ben, this is yours, so let's go to you. Most underrated hardcore band ever. Jesus.
Yeah.
It's funny
Thanks.
how we're. It's funny because this bleeds into, or the previous question bleeds into this, and I didn't even intentionally make it that way, but my answer is Verbal Assault, and I think Verbal Assault, they actually toured Europe before Youth of Today, and they kind of mixed the political with the personal, and then had so much power in their music, and they had this huge sound. They had one of the best recordings, like the Trial LP. They had this amazing imagery. They had the best name. They had some of the best songs ever. They were melodic and they were still pissed off. And they're kind of like, to me, they're like, this is what Discord music would have sounded like if Discord didn't go Rev Summer. If like Discord stayed on the hardcore path, like they're spiritually a Discord band. Like Ian produced their first EP, Learn, but they're raging hardcore. So like they're kind of like the best of both worlds. They're like the kind of like the best of DC and New York at the time in that whole second half of the 80s. And to me, they're kind of like everything I love about that era combined into one band. And it's funny how like Alone in a Crowd records 4 songs and plays one show, and like maybe more people know who they are than Verbal Assault, which is just like Verbal Assault like toured the US like a bunch of times, and Europe at least once, maybe a few more. And like they're just this powerhouse band for their time, and like everyone who saw them said they were amazing live. And every photo I've seen of them is just like this artistically shot black and white photo where every member of the band is like jumping 6 feet in the air. It's like, are you kidding me? There's like, this band is like the perfect band. Like you can't poke a hole. There's no hole to be poked in any aspect of this band. And they're fucking smart. Like if you listen to the lyrics, like, at the time you have like bands like JFA singing about Cokes and Snickers. And then you have like me, you, Youth, Crew. And like, you might feel kind of like self-conscious listening to that when you're like a grown ass adult, but like Verbal Assault has that music that you like, the lyrics that you don't grow out of. So like, I think the reason that they're underrated is that they fucked up twice. They fucked up in the 90s when all their music went out of print. And so my generation couldn't find the records really easily. And then again in the streaming era, like Trial got remastered by my friend and former bandmate Nick Townsend, shout out, and like that's on streaming, but like they're taking their sweet time putting that shit on streaming. So like like that's kind of explains why they're not discussed as much as some of their contemporaries. And like the song Trial is like the perfect hardcore song. It doesn't get any better than that. And like the best you can hope for is to have a song as good as Trial, but you're never going to have a song better than that.
Their final like 10-inch only came out on like a Euro label as well. Like it didn't even come out here. It's kind of hard to get still. It took me a while.
That's the only one I don't have.
Yeah, you just got to put it on your want list, dude. Eventually it'll come up. You know, like, I mean, you know, that's the fun thing about collecting records is not, obviously, if you have the money, you can buy anything you want. But like, you know, you set your want list plus like you have a money that you want to spend on it, right? Like, I got to wait until I can get Exit for like under $20, you know, and eventually it'll happen. Just got to wait. You know, I got it.
Exit's, oh, you got it already. So I was going to say, you can get it for under 20.
Yeah, well, I already got it, but I don't think you can from a American seller. Nope, they're all it's all euros.
You're right. You're right.
So it's going to be, I mean, you know, when you see $14.99, it's $29 plus shipping, so $54. Like
there should be a term for that where you're like, oh my god, here's the record I want for the price I want. You click on it and it's all euros.
Yeah. Anyway,
I got your.
I think it's a great selection. You know, my love of Verbal Assault has been well documented on this pod, and I agree. Trial's a perfect song. And
all right, Zach, who's yours?
What's that? Oh, we'll get to me. But I just want to say on Verbal Assault real quick, and we should toss around Verbal Assault to everyone. But I can't remember what it was, but it was like maybe it was when Rev used to like have their catalog in like the 1990s, and it was kind of like a zine. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but that was a thing, right?
What's that?
The which catalog? The Rev catalog?
Yeah, there was like a Rev catalog for the public. Maybe there was kind of like a zine, or no?
Yep.
Yeah, there'll be
I remember that. Yes.
And stuff in it. Yeah.
Right. I remember like there was like, you know, they had a shit ton of people like do their top 10 records of all time, their top 10 punk and hardcore, and I swear like Verbal Assault Trial was like on every single one. You know, it's just like it's a universally loved album from like the people that know what's up. But like for some reason it just didn't like break out beyond that. I don't know why. Daniel, how do you feel about this?
Just out of print. It was out of print for so long.
Exactly. It was never on CD to the power of many other hardcore records, while CDs were the go-to listening to thing for lots of gateway people coming into hardcore, you know?
Yeah. And maybe it didn't miss me because, you know, I guess someone told me it was good, and it was like relatively easy to find on vinyl for a long, long time, you know? So like if you do the vinyl thing, like this was available, but yeah, you're right. It didn't have like a big CD release.
Mm-hmm.
It was on CD, but the CD was long out of print too. I remember finding it. Oh, that's what you're saying. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Joe, do you love this band?
Yeah, I mean, I remember them. I don't know if that helps.
You ever see them? You ever see them play?
No.
Okay.
All right, Daniel, what is yours?
Oh, see, I was trying to get you to go next.
Okay. All right, Joe, what is yours?
Skid Row is my choice.
Taking the Benji way out.
Yeah. No, I was thinking, you know, and then this may be, you know, that borderline question that we were talking about earlier of that gray area 1.2 band, but I think MDC
1.5.
Yeah, 1.5. Sorry. Yeah, you're right. I'm so sorry, Ben. I think MDC deserves a whole lot more credit than they get. Because of the political tilt to a lot of the lyrics. I mean, there was a bunch of junk too. But you know, they also had they're the first band I can think of that sang about, you know, being a vegetarian and being vegan, you know, in the early 80s. I mean, I know Crass was doing a little bit as well, but I wasn't really tuned into them until much later. But, you know, they weren't super aggressive. And, you know, I think what happened is that they got sort of tied into MRR too much, that people sort of just turned their backs on them because of all the I don't want to say hate that MRR put onto the public, but you guys, you know what I'm talking about. The
a little bit of elitism.
Yeah. That's that's the right word. That's what I was looking for. And I think MDC got kind of thrown into that. But I've always loved that band. I think they deserve more. Yeah. So I'm going with MDC.
I think it's a great pick.
And I know they're loved, but they should have been more.
Yeah, I mean, two classic 7-inches, one classic LP. I guess I don't know. I never took the whole ride. Like, I never listened to like the next album, Smoke Signals '86. Like, does the sound change?
It changes a bit, yeah. But everyone, 86. That's the year of change.
Right.
So,
right.
85, 86.
Yeah, maybe like I don't know, but I feel like they're considered a classic band, but maybe you're right that like they don't get the love. Ben, what do you think on that?
I was thinking about them a lot lately because they started as Stains, not to be confused with the SST band Stains.
That's true.
And they put out that John.
That's another classic 7-inch. So they got that.
John Wayne Was a Nazi. Yeah. Yep. John Wayne Was a Nazi is the A side. The B side is Born to Die, which contains the lyrics "No war, no KKK, no fascist USA," and you hear people chanting at marches, "No Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA." They're reciting MDC lyrics without realizing it. And my first thought was, those are MDC lyrics. My second thought was, maybe they took like a previous chant and turned it into a song. It's like, no, those are MDC lyrics. They wrote those lyrics because there are articles about it. And then I think kind of what hurt them, it's funny. This is the craziest show I ever saw. I mean, just the weirdest bill. This is how weird the early 90s were. In 1992, I saw at Spanky's Cafe in Riverside, MDC, Guttermouth, and Face to Face. And I want to say the Voodoo Glow Skulls also played that show. It's like so random.
I swear to God, I'm either having deja vu or Ben's repeating two stories he's told.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, that was definitely a show I saw because that's the only show I ever went to at Spanky's.
Joe, you're supposed to jump in with the club. When people are out of line.
No, I'll just jump in with. I saw Voodoo Glow Skulls with Strife, so
I feel like I saw.
I was at that too.
Yeah,
I was there at the Palace.
Yep. Daniel, what is your most underrated? Oh, you want me to go first?
No, I did. I was trying to just shuffle the deck a little bit because we always go in an order or whatever. Amenity. I'm going to say Amenity don't get, on a national scale at all, maybe even anywhere really outside of San Diego, any kind of love or respect that such great records should garner. They toured. They were a band full of San Diego people coming at things with a thoughtful passion, showing others that people of color can excel beautifully in hardcore, pillars of the scene, organizing, welcoming bands down from Seattle, welcoming bands from across the country to come play, and putting out absolutely stellar, incredible music. And it's a shame that it's not available for many people to listen to, and it's a shame that it's not a passed on band maybe outside of our purview,
Yeah, well, let me jump in real quick on you, Daniel. Just so everyone that wants to listen to them, they do it right for like bands that their stuff went out of print. So you can download the whole discography on Bandcamp for free. They have it as name your own price. So you can go to sandiegopunk.bandcamp.com and download the whole Amenity discography.
See, I didn't know that.
Yeah, man. I got it on my iPhone. I did my homework before the Tim interview, and everyone check out, I think it's like episode 8 or episode 9, I interviewed Tim from Amenity. We went through all this stuff, and you'll realize that like this is a classic band. Like Daniel, I just had to jump in and say that before I forgot.
Yeah, no, and it's appreciated because now I'm going to utilize that.
Yeah,
You
man.
know, but don't you agree? Like, if you're talking about 1.5 bands, Amenity is kind of like a 2.5 band, where the aggression and the sound is getting heavier, but it's still pushing the boundaries and being weird in certain ways. And, you know, they're really expanding genres within being a hardcore band. And, I mean, it's incredible music. And if anyone is listening to this pod and now they have that gateway to get all this music, please give it a listen, because it is really good. And then turn a friend onto it.
Yeah, they're a great band, and the way they have the discography lined out too, it starts with the later stuff first, and then goes back. Because the first, like, I don't want to be critical of Amenity, but the first 7-inch is not very spectacular, in my opinion. The self-titled 7-inch, I mean, they're children, right? They're teenagers.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're trying to do like the music of the time, like 1987. They're playing like, you know, straight edge hardcore. But their stuff really expands in the other releases. So if you download the discography, you'll see, those last 3 7-inches they do are fucking great, and they really embody like the best of hardcore, like musically and like the people behind them, the people behind the songs. You know, this is great music, and that's like, it's just, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there. 1990, 1992. Is the span of like their great 7-inches, and it just seems like that's a weird time for hardcore music more so than anything, you know. So maybe it's a timing issue. If this is our struggle, the Chula Vista and the Breathe 7-inches come out and like they're starting in 94, it might be completely different.
Yeah.
Or if they made a proper album, I don't know. Maybe that wouldn't make it any different, but like. Yep. A band that puts out 4 EPs as opposed to just like maybe 1 or 2 EPs and then an LP. Like LPs seem to be like, that's what people are remembered by for some reason, even though in hardcore EPs are more suitable for the style of music. But that's kind of.
Yeah, I mean,
that's fair. That's fair. So they also, like, that discography came out in 94, but I don't know how many were pressed and what the distro was. But I agree with you, Ben, because actually their musical style, it more lends to an LP, I think, instead of a 7-inch. Like, I would have loved to have an Amenity LP, you know, but everyone can download the full discography and check it out. And dudes, I love all your answers. I think that I can just agree that you 3 are right, and I don't have to choose one.
Oh, you have to.
You son of a bitch.
Whack.
You have to.
All right, then. Well, I got to cheat, because there's a lot of stuff, like, you know, both powerhouses, the Florida and the Oakland, both super, super underrated. That Vows 7-inch that came out on Indecision Records, I didn't even know about it until I did the second Rob interview, and that thing is fucking perfect hardcore. Yeah, and then also that Faded Gray LP, you know, they do such a good job of pushing the boundaries while staying in like that straightforward hardcore lane. I absolutely love it. I wish more people sang the praises of it, but I do really got to agree with Ben here, and you know, Verbal Assault is probably the best answer. They're probably the most underrated hardcore band ever. They're like great.
Yeah, because of the breadth of work plus the amount of effort they put out to be everywhere and do everything. It is it's a very incredible answer.
And
also, I mean, we could,
because Trials 87.
We could have gone the route of going, you know, some of the European hardcore bands that simply just didn't get a look in from
Raw
many
Power,
closed-minded people, because they're just like, oh, it's Euro shit, you know. Yeah, or like Raw Power, but I feel like they are regarded very high in the sound.
Raw Power is probably like the one band that transcends. Because Screams from the Gutter is all-time classic. I mean, in my opinion, but I mean, I thought that about MDC too. So, like Joe, if you feel that way, I mean, that's totally legit. Like that raw power is.
I just don't see, like random kids with, raw power t-shirts, that they made themselves, or
that's fair,
or MDC patches, or, like on occasion you'll see that stuff, but for the most part, it's not the same as what you see with, Minor Threat or something like that,
Yeah, that's fair.
Dan, are you a fan of Force Down?
Nowhere near as much as the Amenity stuff.
I'm the reverse of you. Like I love Force Down. They're like the Led Zeppelin of hardcore, and I mean that in a good way.
Well, I hate Led Zeppelin, so
yeah.
Talk about a band that might suffer from being EP only. I mean, like they're doing like a double 7-inch and shit. It's like put that thing on an LP, and yeah, maybe it's. I don't know. I mean, it's just it's hard for me to judge that stuff because I wasn't there, and so like maybe the double 7-inch is a selling point. Maybe it makes it more popular than if it's
also 7 inches were a lot cheaper to make then. Now it's just as expensive to make a 7 inch as an LP, but back then vinyl pressing places were giving you like really, really, really cheap 7 inches compared to putting out the LP and the jackets and everything else that comes with doing an LP.
Yeah, fair enough. And also like they let you do low runs of like the price break was at 300 on a 7-inch, and also like, a 7-inch with a photocopied cover doesn't seem as obscene as a LP with a photocopied cover.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Agreed.
So I mean, I wish I could think of another one. I mean, obviously I think that Funeral Oration, I think, is underrated. Like in the CD glory era, like they were on Hopeless, like other bands were doing in the tens of thousands, and like they sold like 2,000 or 3,000 copies. I love that first CD on Hopeless, and I love the 80s LP Communion lots.
That's what I'm saying. Like, why is there an innate like kind of stigma against Euro bands, but then Japanese bands are lauded? Do you know what I mean? It's a weird thing.
Okay, well, the Funeral Oration one makes somewhat sense, I believe, because like there are a lot of classic like Dutch hardcore records. Like that's like a hole that people go down and can discover a bunch of great hardcore music. Like I've never done that like dive because I'm a poser, but like, the record store dudes, like they're like that's that you can dive down that hole. And I think there's a lot of classic shit. And the knock on Funeral Oration would be like, they're a band that they didn't sing in Dutch, they sang in English. So they might have like, that might lose a little bit of like their authenticity, you know?
I think the people there are people who like international hardcore. Like the same kind of person who would get really into Japanese hardcore is also the same kind of person that would get into like Finnish hardcore or Italian hardcore. I mean, in my experience meeting people in the scene, like there is that type, like like Mike Thrashhead, if you know that guy. Like,
no, you're very right. There are Chad Strout is one who, looks across the world for interesting, great things like that, and celebrates that they probably don't have the American pretension when they come to putting their music together,
Who are some good European hardcore bands that people should check out, Dan?
Sportswear.
Well, are we talking about of today or?
No, of all time, like all-time greats. I mean, if today there are some they're still around, them
I think
too.
this is a topic for another episode. We should wrap.
Okay, all right. We'll
that's
put
like
a
that's a nice big one that we should do some research on. So
you're right.
But Daniel doesn't whiff and everyone gets mad at him.
I'm not going to be helpful on that one, but we should definitely tackle it.
Yeah, man, I agree. Okay, I think this is a great episode. Does anyone have anything else they forgot to say and want to slide in or anything like that?
I just wanted to throw in, we were talking about hardcore bands signed to majors. I forgot all about the Bad Brains.
Yep. I could tell you how many copies they sold of their 2 major label albums.
Yeah, 12 or 13.
No, they did moderate, 50,000 approximately. for the Rise and Gotta Love.
Yeah.
There you go.
The thing with that is, you know, did they get to live on the road? Like, obviously, with HR,
yeah.
breaking from that, but they could have. They toured with the Beastie Boys, you know.
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
Alrighty. Okay. Everyone, thanks for listening. And again, if you have topics you want us to do, or if you have questions, go ahead and email 185milessouth@gmail.com. And we'll talk to you again on Monday.